My Mother with Her Hands as Knives by Dave Khimasia. In researching What is the What, my book about the life of Valentino Akak-Den, one of the lost boys of Sudan, I traveled with Valentino back to his hometown of Mariel Bai in 2003. There, we located his family, who Valentino had not seen in 17 years. While in Sudan, I interviewed many women who, as young girls, had been abducted by militiamen, the same militia who now plagued Darfur, and who had been forced to serve as servants and concubines in the households of military officers in the north of Sudan. That prompted more research into the experiences of these Sudanese women. The passage below, which was cut from What is the What, is an account from a young woman shortly after she was freed. In this passage, I framed her story as if she were telling it to Valentino, while they were both living in Kamuka, a refugee camp in the northwest of Kenya. Because this passage was cut at an early stage of the book, it's a bit rougher than it might otherwise be. I was born in Rurak in southern Sudan. When my mother was young, she was blessed by great fertility. She gave birth to 20 babies, and I was the 16th. Most are gone now. Our father was a successful farmer. He kept 180 head of cattle and raised ground nuts and sorghum, maize, okra, and sesame. There was plenty to feed us. And he traded the rest for luxuries like mattresses and dresses. When I was very small, I had a doll made in China. You know how rare something like that is, Valentino? In 1983, the war was on. The militia, the Mujahideen came. I was 1 or 2 years old, so I remember none of this. The Arabs killed 20 men, including my uncle, my father's brother. They took most of my father's cattle and kidnapped 3 of my siblings, 2 brothers, 5 and 7, and 1 sister who was 8. I don't really remember them, just as you said. You do not remember your older siblings, Valentino. There were 4 of us left, all under 5, except my brother, joke, who had escaped the Merlin by hiding in the river. He had used a pole to breathe. I don't know where he learned to do that. When he got home from the river, my mother sent him with a walking horse like you. She wanted him to be safe and study in Ethiopia. Our family moved to Pethau, where there was no SPLA. My father thought we would be safer there. And we were for a time. My mother was blessed with more children. In 1986, the Mujahideen came again. This time taking my 2 eldest sisters. They killed another uncle, my mother's brother, as he tried to defend the family. He threw a spear at one of the Arabs, and the Arabs cut off each one of his limbs one by one, and then threw him on the fire. Everyone in the village could hear him screaming. They threw his limbs down the well, poisoning all the water for everyone in the village. My sisters were gone, and my father was furious. My father did something unusual then. He followed the Merlin. He took his spear and all the money we had, and he went north, because he knew that very often the Merlin didn't travel fast. They'd like to make their Dinka slaves walk. My father spent a year in the north. He went as far as Khartoum, looking in the streets and the peace camps for my sisters. He returned a year later. And when he did, he seemed defeated. It appeared that he had aged 10 years in one. He spoke to no one. He wouldn't eat. He had been a prominent man, and now he was so skinny that he looked like a boy. In his body, though, his face looked so old. He died 2 weeks later. After my father died, there were 5 of us left, all girls. My mother used to lament having so many girls we couldn't defend ourselves. Pentha was raided 4 more times as we lived there. We worked at the farm with help from the boys in the town who had been orphaned. Then the Nur raided us. It was so very strange because we didn't know to fear them. But one day they arrived and raped many of the women and took all they could carry. I hid under a tree. In 1988, the Merlin came again. They came straight to our home with 3 men on horses. They wore white and approached, and our mother was silent. We were hidden among the livestock, and they entered the hut as if they knew where we were. This is how they took me and my sisters. All 5 of us. They told my mother that they'd been told by Bashir that all Dinka girls were to be impregnated by Muslim babies, and they were doing their duty. My mother asked them if they intended to rape us right there and right then. The man said, no, we would be impregnated on a proper bed, and that our babies would be brought up in the only civilization that Islam could provide. They tied our hands and tied us to one another, and we waited in the cattle pen until the next morning, when they took us north. My mother came to us that night, as we waited with the 11 other girls in the cattle pen. She said, I will come to get you. Just be patient. I will see you soon and bring you home. In the morning, we were walked out of the village on the main road. Most of the men had ridden ahead, and we were guarded by 5 young men on horseback. They poked us with their swords when we walked too slowly. When we stopped to rest for water, they insisted that they show us our genitals. They told us that we would soon be freed of our sinful parts that made us licentious. Otherwise, they didn't touch us. And every hour they didn't touch us, I thanked God. After 4 days, we stopped in an Arab town, and we were brought into a building that was cool and dark. It was a school. There were desks and chalkboards. We were seated on the floor and left there for half a day. We heard the activity in town. Everything seemed very normal. Sometimes an Arab boy would peek through the window at us, hold up his fist, or spit on the window. Men were then brought into the school, escorted by one of the young Arabs who had kidnapped us. The men would confer, and twice they left with one of the girls. We didn't see them pay the kidnappers, but who knows? But soon there were 14 of us. My sisters and I stayed close and argued over the best strategy. We'd been told that Arabs like to split up families for fear that siblings would conspire against them. So we worried that we would see us together and guess we were related. In the end, we split up in 2 pairs. At the end of the day, there were no more visitors. We did not eat that day. We slept there, on the floor, with our heads rested on each other's thighs and stomachs. In the morning, we were made to walk again, but there were 13 of us now. I don't know what happened to the youngest girl. She was taken as we slept, I guess. We walked for 4 hours that morning, tied in a line, following the Arabs on their horses. It was so hot that day, and one girl was very sick and very weak. She could not walk. She was thrown onto one of the horses as we continued. Later in the day, the Arabs began to trot their horses to make us go faster. I think they needed to reach a certain town by nightfall. So the pace was now faster. After some time at this pace, when the day was very hot and we were all feeling very faint, I heard a voice. The voice said, "Stop!" The voice was very distant. I turned and saw a figure running towards us. It was a Dinka woman, we could tell. Her face was uncovered. "Stop!" The woman said again, and again, and again as she ran to us. The Arab stopped and everyone turned around. The Dinka woman came closer. She ran like my mother, with her hands very straight like knives. She ran closer, and it was her. The woman was my mother. She had been following our trail. Our stay in that trading town had allowed her to catch up. She yelled at the men, "Give me those girls!" She pointed to us and she wept. "You have taken 4 others," she said. 4 of my children are gone. My husband died looking for them. The Arabs sat on their horses and said nothing. They were very young, these men. They looked at one another, and then one of them turned. Then they all turned and started their horses again. We walked again too. She was not finished. She walked with us. She began to walk next to my sisters and me, and she said nothing. She only walked while holding our hands, becoming part of our group. She walked for an hour before the men realized she was still with us. One of them turned and saw her. They all began to talk loudly to one another, and then to her. My mother spoke some Arabic, and she told them that she would continue to walk wherever we went. She held onto that rope that bound us and said that she was now part of the rope. She said she would walk and walk with us always, to be with us, unless they killed her. One of the men went for his sword, but he was restrained. One man, who looked the youngest, got off his horse and cut the rope. We were the last 5 on the rope. He cut it and kicked my mother in the stomach. He got on his horse, spit in our direction, and then the group walked on without us. They were finished with us. "Fuck them," they said, and rode off. We ran in the other direction, my mother leading us, running with her knife hands as we got on the road and ran through the grass. We slept in holes. We traveled back to the south. The day we returned, it rained heavier than I have seen in many years. And this was God crying in joy. He cried and cried for us. For a full day he cried, while my mother danced, sang, and ran around the village like she was possessed.